Good afternoon. I call to order the informal interactive hearing of the General Assembly with Indigenous peoples held in accordance with Resolution 71/321 of 8 September 2017. I'd like to warmly welcome all of you to this meeting. This hearing provides an opportunity for all relevant stakeholders to reflect on possible further measures necessary to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant United Nations meetings on issues affecting them, as well as inform the intergovernmental process of the General Assembly that will resume at its 75th session. With your permission, I will now deliver my opening statement. Thank you all for being here. In particular, I'd like to thank Assistant Secretary General Gilmore and Ms. Walid Abu Bakrain, as our distinguished chair, and all the elders and indigenous representatives we have in the room today. I have the honor to serve as the President of the United Nations General Assembly, and so I get many opportunities to speak at the United Nations. But I know that this is not the same for everyone in this room. That's why today it is your hearing, not mine. And that's why I want to limit myself to a few brief remarks before turning the floor over to you. In doing so, I'll make 4 main points. First, I want to talk about how we got here. It was nearly 100 years ago when Indigenous peoples first asserted their rights on the international stage. But they did not see much progress, at least until 1982, when the first working group on the indigenous populations was established. And in 2007, the rights of indigenous peoples were finally set out in an international instrument. Let us be clear here. Rights are not aspirational. They are not ideals. They are not best-case scenarios. They are minimum standards. They are non-negotiable, and they must be respected and promoted. Yet, here we are, more than a decade after the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted. And the fact is, these rights are not being realized. That's not to say that there has been no progress. In fact, we heard many success stories during yesterday's opening of the Permanent Forum. But they are not enough. Which is why, as my second point, I want to say that we need to do much more. Last September, the General Assembly gave my office a new mandate. It requested that I organize informal, interactive hearings to look at how indigenous peoples can better participate at the United Nations. So that's why we are all sitting here. But before we launch into our discussions, I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. I know that many of you were disappointed with the General Assembly's decision last year. After 2 years of talking, many of you wanted more than these interactive hearings. We cannot gloss over this, and that's why I want to address it from the outset. But I must also say this. Things may be moving slowly, but they are still moving. When our predecessors formed the first Indigenous Working Group in 1982, their chances were slim. Many doubted whether an international instrument could be adopted. And frankly, it took longer than it should have. But it still happened. So we need to acknowledge the challenges and frustrations. We cannot sweep them under the rug. But we also cannot let them take away from the opportunities we have in front of us. And that brings me to my third point on our discussions today. This is your hearing. So please be blunt. Please be concrete. Please be innovative. Like I have said, we should not pretend that everything is perfect. Major problems persist, particularly at the national level, and we need to draw attention to them. Today, however, we have a very specific mandate, and that is to explore how we can carve out more space for indigenous peoples on the international stage. That's why I ask you to focus on the future of our work here at the United Nations, and to try to come up with as many ideas and proposals as possible. In particular, we should look at the following questions. Which venues and forums are most suitable? What modalities should govern participation? What kind of participants should be selected? And how will this selection happen? We should also try to form a broader vision. This will allow us to better advise the General Assembly's ongoing process to enhance indigenous peoples' participation. Finally, next steps. As you know, this is our very first informal interactive hearing. There will be 2 further hearings, next year and the year after. Then, during what we call the 75th session of the General Assembly, negotiations between governments will start up again. Turning back to today, the immediate outcome of our hearing will be a President's summary. But I'm confident that the longer-term outcome will be yet another step in the direction of change. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is where I will conclude. My main job now is to listen, and I thank you for your attention. And I now give the floor to Mr. Andrew Gilmore, Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. Please.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Excellencies, colleagues. The rights of indigenous peoples in many places around the world are today at best unmet and at worst under active threat. And that is why we are very grateful to the President of the General Assembly for organizing this important event and for his other efforts in this regard. The participation of indigenous peoples in UN processes has definitely increased since the 1980s, when the UN formally began to work on this topic. And their participation has been recognized not only as a clear right, but also as a valuable contribution to our common understanding of some vital global issues. In the UN human rights system, we are fortunate enough to have the special rapporteur, the UN expert mechanism, and the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. But here in New York, we have worked for over a decade with the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which has been a very useful tool in raising awareness of their issues. Moreover, to take an example, the Paris Agreement acknowledged the important contribution of indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge when it comes to mitigating the effects of climate change. In recent years, the UN system has sought to create a space so that the expertise of indigenous peoples can play a proper role in our work. And this effort is about making the UN inclusive of indigenous peoples' representative institutions. Thus, we welcome the call for regional consultations by the General Assembly last year as an important opportunity to ensure that the views of as many indigenous communities as possible, including women and youth groups, are fully considered in every effort made being to advance their agenda. Institutions of indigenous peoples manifest themselves in a wide variety of forms, as federations of peoples, autonomous governments and parliaments, community-based decision-making bodies, and other groups. While some states formally recognize these institutions, others do not. We feel that our challenge lies in ensuring that, regardless of their status in their own countries, they have the ability to participate in UN processes. Should we fail to achieve this, we will miss out on hearing the voices of all indigenous peoples' representatives from all regions of the world. And that is why this meeting today, which is part of the wider consultation process, could be so important. And against this backdrop, and perhaps for me it's the second elephant in the room that the President referred to, we find the current trend of increased violence against indigenous defenders in many countries to be profoundly troubling. We find courageous indigenous representatives trying to defend their ancestral lands and their local environments, being threatened, brutally assaulted, and in many cases killed. It should surely go without saying that we, the peoples of the UN Charter, must include indigenous peoples, that the phrase leaving no one behind from the SDGs must include indigenous peoples, and non-discrimination must include indigenous peoples. But it is essential that we actually do more to show that we understand this, and this meeting is a useful step in this regard. Thank you very much.
I thank the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights for his statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Mariam Waled Abu Bakrain, Chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Thank you. Distinguished Excellencies, delegates from member states, Indigenous brothers and sisters, I would like to express my gratitude to His Excellencies Ms. Rolav Lajczak, President of the General Assembly, for inviting me as the Chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to this informal interactive hearing. The Permanent Forum acknowledges the effort and commitment made by President of the General Assembly to carry forward the consultation and establish the framework for future negotiations. I would like also to thank you for your excellent presentation yesterday at the opening ceremony of the Permanent Forum. It was a very, very strong message for Indigenous peoples and for the Forum. The Permanent Forum recognizes the existing current good practices within the United System that allow for the participation of Indigenous peoples under the Economic and Social Council and the Human Rights Council in particular. Their participation at the session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples. I also check against delivery, not that the participation of Indigenous peoples is limited at other venues, many of which deal with issues that directly affect the rights and well-being of Indigenous peoples. Current processes do not recognize the status of Indigenous peoples' governance and representative institutions, many which are already recognized by member states at the national, local, and community level. We need a kind of harmony between these two recognitions. Indigenous peoples' representative institutions are not NGO. Our chiefs, our parliamentarians have to sit in a dignity places. Member states recognize this at the national level, but the United Nations has not developed a mechanism to recognize this, and this needs to be resolved. Over the past years, Indigenous peoples are increasingly participating at the United Nations, but Indigenous peoples still remain marginalized from important decision-making process. We need to do more. Indigenous peoples' participation at the United Nations has been a positive experience. Indigenous peoples have demonstrated that they wish to and can work peacefully in partnership with member states to address their issues and of common concern, such as the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, climate change, as mentioned by Mr. Gilmore, peace building, and other emerging issues. To conclude, Indigenous peoples are counting on the General Assembly to move this process forward so that Indigenous peoples can continue to enrich the work of the United Nations for our common good. The Permanent Forum remains ready and committed to advance this important process, and I would like to emphasize on the fact that we don't want that this hearing come with any kind of diminution of participation rights that Indigenous peoples have already within the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the Chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I now give the floor to Chief Wilton Littlechild, a Cree lawyer, advocate, and former Member of Parliament who has worked to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, who will deliver a keynote statement. Please.
Mr. President, Your Excellencies, Nigan Kahkio, the Tamskadna, Egoatsota, Ino Epiksquid, Eximstahen and Askamon. Thank you very much. I just bring you greetings in my language. And yes, Mr. President, the General Assembly resolution last fall was a disappointment to Indigenous peoples in that we have not yet achieved the goal of enhancing our participation at the UN. However, we can all work together with the resolution in order to advance the issue, and we know member states stand with us in this work. Indigenous peoples have made significant contributions to the international system, and we will continue to do so. The Permanent Forum, MRIP, and the Special Rapporteur are providing excellent input to the General Assembly on this and other issues. These important relationships will continue to increase to serve us all. For the states who have concerns about our participation, know that Indigenous peoples want to work with you to address your concerns. I truly believe that by working together, we can reach a common understanding that Indigenous peoples' enhanced participation would be an overwhelming success for the General Assembly. The adoption of the Declaration was the culmination of incredible efforts by Indigenous peoples, allies, and member states. Internationally, significant progress on the Declaration is ongoing. To date, the General Assembly has reconfirmed the United Nations Declaration at least 8 times, and that is something to celebrate. Indigenous peoples are actively implementing the Declaration in governance, in negotiations, and yes, in litigation. Human rights education is growing, and the Declaration is being used in diverse ways at the community level. Globally, Indigenous peoples and states are learning about the Declaration and how to use it to promote harmonious and cooperative relations, mutual respect, understanding, and shared prosperity. The current process to provide for increased participation of Indigenous peoples within the UN system must not be used to undermine in any way the UN Declaration. This process should be recognizing our status as positive contributing actors at all levels of the UN. To fail to determine ways and means for ensuring Indigenous participation is inconsistent with Articles 41 and 42 of the Declaration. In particular, in denying Indigenous participation at the UN General Assembly, no substantive reasons have been provided, except that some states are firmly against such involvement. Some states are also insisting they must determine who is Indigenous in regard to Indigenous participation in UN bodies. Such positions are discriminatory and contrary to international human rights law. States should not be seeking to renegotiate what was explicitly rejected during the negotiations on the UN Declaration. In the ways and means of promoting participation at the UN of Indigenous representatives on issues affecting them, the report of the Secretary General, it is emphasized that in accordance with the UN Declaration, and I quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-identify as such. The right to self-determination and the fact that there is no agreed definition of Indigenous peoples should be borne in mind. And I underscore, it is important to ensure that the process to determine recognized Indigenous peoples representatives strengthens Indigenous peoples' participation through their institutions, representative bodies, and organizations. In international law, there's no legal basis to insist that states must determine which peoples or persons are Indigenous. UN treaty bodies and mechanisms have repeatedly emphasized the right of Indigenous peoples to self-identification. Some proposals put forward by states fell short in failing to fully respect the UN Declaration and the operative paragraph 33 of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Article 2, indeed, of the Declaration affirms Indigenous peoples and individuals are free and equal to all other peoples, and individuals have the right to be free from any kind of discrimination in the exercise of their rights, in particular, that based on their indigenous origin or identity. In this whole context, it's worth recalling preambular paragraph 18 of the UN Declaration, and I quote, "Convinced that the recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples in this declaration will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations between the state and indigenous peoples based on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. In order to safeguard the integrity of the international human rights system and uphold existing commitments, it's critical that states remain supportive of enhanced participation by indigenous peoples. We can find a way forward working together. To the states, you have nothing to fear in creating space for the participation of indigenous peoples. Yes, we have called for attention on our concerns, but we also have always offered solutions. What have we contributed to the human family, for example? Let me remind you very briefly the recognition of spiritual rights, focus on climate change, the extended family, indigenous laws, restorative justice, justice circles, sports and traditional games as human rights, that Indian treaties are international and sacred agreements, promoting peaceful coexistence, holistic health, and leadership by our elders. These, among other indigenous perspectives, are benefits to humankind. We have more to offer. Finally, Mr. President, there are 3 specific recommendations I want to make, but in the interest of time, I will submit them in writing and simply conclude by saying, when I first came here 40 years ago, I asked my elders, what is it that you're seeking from the international arena? And this is what they said. All we want is recognition, respect, and justice. So I ask you all today, do we have recognition? Do we have respect? And do we have justice? And I leave that to you. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Chief Littlechild for his statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Mirna Cunningham, Miskita feminist, indigenous rights activist, and president of the Fund for Development of Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean from Nicaragua, who will deliver a keynote statement. Please.
Thank you. Al sutra tutniyamni. Les saludo.
I bring you the greetings of the indigenous peoples of Nicaragua and from the Council for the Fund for Development of the Indigenous People of Latin America and the Caribbean. Why are we coming to the United Nations and say we want to expand our participation? We are seeking to expand our participation at the United Nations in order to achieve the provisions established in the Declaration. We come to ensure the full exercise of our rights based on Article 41 of the Declaration, but based on our own voices. Almost all of the subjects which are discussed in the United Nations affect us. Therefore, we do not want participation which reduces us to be in certain areas. We want to participate in the General Assembly, in the subsidiary organs, in specific meetings, at high-level meetings, and other areas of decision-making. Therefore, we believe that the General Assembly must make a recommendation, a specific recommendation, which is defined for all of its bodies, including the Human Rights Council, ECOSOC, and which will also include the entities, agencies, funds, and associated processes. Participation in the General Assembly must be on an equal basis, regional and representative. I therefore believe that the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is the most suitable representative body we can count on. The designation of independent experts goes through a process which can be perfective, but which will guarantee parity, a certain degree of representativity, geographic considerations, as well as gender and others. Therefore, I suggest that we give the Permanent Forum a special status as a representative body of the indigenous peoples at the General Assembly, ensuring that there were statements, times, and participation of the social, cultural subjects which are being discussed from the 7 regions. We can also have participation of indigenous representatives who can take part in draft resolution and negotiations on different themes, as is the case on the high-level meeting, which was a World Conference, which appointed indigenous people. And we also have to have procedures of structural consultation in order to obtain free, prior, and informed consent from peoples on different subjects. That proposal requires the strengthening of the Permanent Forum with technical assistance, financial resources, and logistics, as well as a mechanism for permanent coordination between the 3 bodies already established in the United Nations to deal with the work of the indigenous peoples, and which will contribute to synergy and will strengthen the system. In order to be able to ensure indigenous participation, it will be necessary to increase the voluntary contribution fund and appeal specifically to member states and other bodies to allocate resources to it. The mechanism of accreditation established currently to participate in the Permanent Forum will have to continue to be established not only for the Forum, but for other areas in the United Nations, taking into account the different forms, organizational forms of the United Nations, their own governments, their own institutions, but also bodies which are created through constructive agreements which certain states have attained with the indigenous people, as is the case with my country, where we already have independent regions. Therefore, the autonomous indigenous governments should also have a form of accreditation. The SWAP has already which has been established and is a very useful tool which would increase participation, but it requires improving the mandates and coherence between the different levels of the United Nations systems at global level, at regional level, and at country level. And this also must be accompanied with improving participation mechanism at the state level. We already have important experience of linkages and partnerships which can be used in this process. For example, the participation of indigenous people in the IFAD, which with a policy, a forum, a fund, and a mechanism for dialogue and cooperation when formulating the IFAD. And in the case of Latin America, a partnership between the FILA and the agencies of the United Nations, which have recently allowed us to adopt a plan of action between the government and the indigenous people with a 10-year horizon. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to conclude by congratulating the President of the General Assembly for organizing this interactive dialogue, and to all of those who, over the years, have made their contributions to this theme. But mainly, I'd like to thank the sisters and brothers of the indigenous people who, with their presence, with their voices, and their contributions, have allowed us to reach this level of maturity in the debate. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Cunningham for her statement. We have heard the last speaker for the opening segment. As indicated in the program, this informal interactive hearing consists of an opening segment and an interactive discussion. During the interactive discussion, participants are encouraged to limit their interventions to 3 minutes in order to provide for maximum participation. All participants are encouraged to avoid speaking from written statements. To assist speakers in managing their time, arrangements have been made for the microphone light to start blinking to indicate that they have 1 minute left to wrap up their statement. When the 1 minute is up, the light will stay on to signal to the speaker to conclude his or her intervention. I hope that you will allow me, when necessary and in an appropriate manner, to notify speakers when the time is up. I would like to inform participants that those wishing to speak are kindly requested to press the button located at the base of the microphone in order to be placed on the list of speakers. Representatives of the Secretariat will walk around the chamber to ascertain the names of the participants wishing to speak. Once your name has been inscribed on the list, your microphone button will be deactivated. When a participant has been given the floor, kindly press the microphone button again. The green light on your microphone will guide the technician to activate your microphone. Once the light on your microphone turns red, indicating that your microphone has been activated, you may proceed to make your intervention. I now open the floor for an interactive discussion and invite participants to make comments and pose questions. As first, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to start by thanking you, Mr. President, for your strong statement today and at the opening session of the Permanent Forum in support of the indigenous people's participatory rights. As one of the 4 advisors of the 2 previous presidents of the General Assembly, I would like to thank all the member states and representatives of indigenous peoples for their active engagement during the consultation process in the 70th and the 71st session of the General Assembly. We had rich discussions on promoting the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions at the UN in issues affecting them. The consensus resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the topic last fall, while a disappointment to many, ensured continued deliberations in partnership with indigenous peoples and requested a report from the Secretary General on the participation, including based on this process and some of the questions that were raised during the negotiations. The The General Assembly also urges all relevant UN bodies to follow up on the call for further efforts to facilitate participation. For instance, the Human Rights Council could, as a first step, decide to hold a panel discussion on or an expert workshop on how to realize indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions' participation at the Council. The informal hearings by the President of the General Assembly are important for the preparation of the discussions for further measures of enhanced participation at the 75th session. We are happy to participate in this hearing today and are looking forward to the comments that will be made regarding the possible way forward. I also hope that the information compiled by the advisors over the past two General Assemblies and publicly available on the UN website can be built upon in the work paving the way for the 75th session. Greater involvement of indigenous peoples from all regions of the world in the coming process, including through national and regional consultations, will be important in order to ensure that indigenous peoples are heard during the preparations of the report of the Secretary General. Only through respectful partnership between member states and indigenous peoples can we ensure solutions that ensure indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions future enhanced participation at the United Nations, including in the General Assembly, ECOSOC, and the Human Rights Council. There's clearly expressed will in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that ways and means of ensuring participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them shall be established also at the UN. The high-level meeting of the General Assembly, known as the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, made a commitment to considering ways to enable the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in meetings of relevant United Nations bodies on issues affecting them, and it has been solidified by the agreement last fall to continue the considerations in the 75th session and with a preparatory process leading to it. We have now to follow the framework provided by the resolution while working to enhance indigenous peoples' participation. The indigenous peoples need to be heard and meaningfully participate during these discussions. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland. I now give the floor to Ms. Aili Keskitalo, representing Sami parliaments of Norway, Finland, Sweden, Sami Council, Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Mr. President, Pori Holomot, dear Excellencies and representatives of indigenous peoples, I speak on behalf of the following Arctic indigenous peoples, institutions and organizations: the Sami parliaments of Finland, Norway, Sweden, the Sami Parliamentary Council, as well as Inuit Circumpolar Council and the Sami Council. First, to the elephant. Let me express our dissatisfaction with the outcome of the consultation process we had over the last 3 years. This is the first time we meet after the GA resolution on indigenous peoples' participation was passed last fall. And let me just state the obvious. The result is far from what was on the table when we last time consulted with the states. We are dismayed by the result, as it seems like the states have disregarded all major elements that we thought we agreed on. The member states asked us for our red lines, and they made sure to go well below that as soon as they had thrown us out of the room. This is not in accordance with the principles of free, prior, and informed consent and consultations obligations established in your own agreed rules in the UNDRP. We note that the UN itself is not willing or able to adhere to its own standards. We, the peoples of the United Nations, as it is prominently stated in the UN Charter, should and must embrace the contributions and rights of the indigenous peoples of the world. We had such high hopes for a new era of work together with the peoples of the world when the UNDRIP was adopted back in 2007. In 2014, the heads of states of the UN agreed to find new modalities and working methods respecting the representatives of indigenous peoples and their contribution. In our view, this process has demonstrated that the member states lack the interests in fulfilling these ambitions. We do have a lot to offer to our global community and have turned to our common body to establish working methods and a participatory status that respect our status as peoples, all in good faith. It is discouraging to note that our 2 years of work resulted in a resolution that we do not recognize. We are now in a situation where we are asked to contribute to a process where we see more questions than answers, and we hope the Honourable PGA can guide us on how this process is to proceed. We are curious to how we are to move forward as we maintain our primary positions. We did our best to adjust and to address the concerns of member states during the last couple of years of consultations, but we did not expect states to simply disregard our input. We are seeking the PGI guidance on how we can re-establish a constructive dialogue on the participatory rights of indigenous peoples' representative institutions in all UN fora during these consultations. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making on all levels. We are still waiting for the UN to accept this principle for its own governing bodies. As long as we are kept out of the room, these rights are not implemented. We still have the position that indigenous representatives institutions should be granted participatory rights in the UN on the same level as the vast majority of observers to the UN. That is the only level that would reflect indigenous peoples' position in our global community, without confronting or challenging the position of member states in the United Nations. Indigenous peoples have contributed to the work of the United Nations over many decades, and we are still aspiring to strengthen our work with you. But in order for this to be meaningful, we will need to get into the building. Mr. President, we are willing to work with you to be able to accomplish our ambitions, to contribute to the work of the UN in the name of peace and prosperity for all, including indigenous peoples. Ologito. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sami parliaments of Norway, Finland, Sweden, Sami Council and Inuit Circumpolar Council. Your message was loud and clear, and it was well heard, and it was well taken note. I now give the floor to Mr. Edward John, representing First Nation Summit Indigenous Peoples in Western Canada.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to speak on this issue. I'd like to acknowledge the words of my brother, Chief Willie Littlechild, and sister, Dr. Myrna Cunningham, and would endorse both of their statements completely and the recommendations from Dr. Myrningham. I've changed her name, Dr. Myrna Cunningham. I would like to say that my name is Edward John. I am an Indigenous hereditary chief holding the name of Kyle Joe, handed down through the generations and an elected leader from British Columbia. And for many of our nations, Indigenous nations in Canada, we see ourselves as governments and not as non-governmental organizations. And many of our governments have no opportunity to be recognized as such in this big house we call the United Nations. In your opening statement, Mr. President, in the 72nd session of the UN General Assembly, I want to quote what you had to say. And some of that was reflected today and yesterday as well in your comments. Sometimes the work of the United Nations can be very complex, but the reason for its establishment is simple. The UN was created for peoples, and in this regard I would add Indigenous peoples. Its job is to help people who are striving for peace and a decent life on a sustainable planet. The people who need the United Nations the most are not sitting in this hall today. They are not involved in the negotiations of resolutions. They do not take the floor at high-level segments. It is one of the tasks of the General Assembly to make sure that their voices can still be heard. And this is the opportunity that we have in front of us so that our voices can be heard. Your statements are very much welcome today, and as well as from your comments at the opening of the General Assembly. You've heard the concerns that have been raised, my sister from the Sami Parliament, and I won't reiterate those. The voices of some 370 million Indigenous peoples need to be heard on the deep and persistent social economic gaps that our peoples face globally, the continued discriminatory practices towards Indigenous peoples, the dispossession and degradation of Indigenous lands, territories and resources, the right to free, prior, informed consent, which is threaded throughout the rights in the Declaration, that of self-determination, lands and territories and resources become the flashpoints of conflict, and the lack of state commitments and actions on the recognition of Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples and their respective rights. Having said that, we remain optimistic. Our resilience and our resistance to be put down continues to be strong. Indigenous peoples, the UN should help Indigenous peoples who strive for peace and decent life on a planet which sustains all life. After a long struggle lasting over 2.5 decades, the UN General Assembly finally adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. It's surprising to me that it always takes such a long time for the recognition of our rights, but now that we have the recognition, we are looking towards being involved in this big house to be able to observe and have a say about these issues that I mentioned above. Indigenous peoples do not sit in this General Assembly hall, and we're not involved in the negotiations of resolutions or able to take the floor at high-level events. In this regard, I want to bring forward that in December 2017, within the context of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize Award on December 10th, within the context of the 25th anniversary of the Nobel Peace Prize Award to Dr. Rigoberta Menchú, an Indigenous woman advocate from Guatemala, the Nobel Peace Prize Forum, the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize Forum was convened to focus on Indigenous peoples in conflict with state-supported development. I was asked to chair this forum, which I was happy to do. The particular focus was on mining, on reindeer herding grounds on which the Sami Indigenous people rely, and on the Standing Rock Sioux and the impacts from the Dakota Access Pipeline on their water sources. An outcome document called Nazal was prepared and will be submitted to your office. Olaf Nolstad, director of the Norwegian Institute, said, "We are pleased about the outcome of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize Forum in the form of the Nazal Declaration. The Norwegian Nobel Institute applauds and fully supports the efforts to convene an inclusive multi-stakeholder dialogue on peace. I want to make a couple of recommendations. That the UN Declaration must be understood as an instrument of peace, where the rights in the Declaration as minimum standards for relationships are applied, and where Indigenous peoples and their rights are respected, recognized, and implemented, peaceful relationships should become the norm. And secondly, that no later than the 75th General Assembly, consistent with Article 18 and Article 42 of the UN Declaration, the voices of the representatives and institutions of Indigenous peoples who strive for peace and decent life should be heard in the United Nations, and that Indigenous peoples are able to take the floor at all high-level events and be fully engaged in the negotiations of resolutions that affect them. And finally, that the President's 3 interactive sessions with Indigenous peoples should proceed in good faith, reflecting the honor and trust responsibilities and obligations of the United Nations to all peoples, including Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the First Nations Summit Indigenous Peoples in Western Canada. In order to accommodate all speakers during the interactive discussions, I would like to remind participants that statements should be limited to 3 minutes, and I thank you for your cooperation. I now give the floor to Ms. Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs of Canada.
Mr. President, elders, excellencies, and Indigenous partners, firstly,
سيدي الرئيس حضرة المندوبين أود أولا أن أحيي كلمات الطيبة والدعاية التي
I have the honor of delivering a joint statement this afternoon on behalf of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. In line with the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and with the aims of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand believe strongly that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate and to be heard in decisions that affect them at the United Nations. This is reflected in Article 18 of the UN Declaration, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights. Nothing about us without us is at the very heart of the UN Declaration. It is what is at stake on this issue of Indigenous representation. We are countries with colonial past. For too long, we have not given a voice to Indigenous peoples in our countries. Today, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are committed to ensuring that Indigenous peoples, wherever they live, are able to influence global decision-making at the UN through meaningful participation in this body. After almost 2 years of consultations, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were disappointed that a system for Indigenous participation at the UN was not established during the 71st General Assembly. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand remain firmly committed to this goal. We continue to urge all bodies and organizations throughout the UN system to work to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples, representatives, and institutions in relevant meetings on issues affecting them. With respect to the specific clusters, we believe that Indigenous peoples should be able to participate in all meetings of the General Assembly. Processes around selection and accreditation must be fair and transparent. Both Indigenous peoples and member states need an open and transparent appeal process. Selection criteria should be applied flexibly. A no objection basis is not acceptable for our delegations. As our discussions move forward, we want to ensure that the UN gives consideration to broader participation of Indigenous peoples, including Indigenous women and girls. We look forward to continued efforts by Indigenous peoples and member states to advance this issue over the next few years and to find innovative solutions to the remaining challenges.
I thank the Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs of Canada. I now give the floor to Ms. Terry Henry, North American expert member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Excellencies, Indigenous peoples, leaders, and parliamentarians, UN agencies and programs, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, I first want to thank you for your strong statement, both yesterday and today, on the participation rights of Indigenous institutions. Thank you. In paragraph 6, the current General Assembly resolution on participation encourages the Secretary General to hold regional consultations, including through the regional commissions as appropriate, with the support of member states and relevant agencies and entities of the United Nations system before the 19th session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and requests the Secretary General to incorporate those inputs in the report. I understand that these consultations are not yet scheduled or funded. The UN views these regional consultations as authorized but not required. I understand that there's no funding set aside either, as stated. Regional consultations are key to building global support for participation. We need some way to break the logjam that we encountered last year, and the regional consultations with appropriate funding to enable meaningful Indigenous participation seems like a good path forward. In the years of work leading up to the 2014 World Conference, Indigenous peoples from the 7 global geopolitical regions, including representatives of the Women's Caucus and Youth Caucus, worked together to develop common positions on key issues facing Indigenous peoples. The result of that work, the ALTA document, called for, at minimum, a permanent observer status within the United Nations system, enabling our direct participation through our own governments and parliaments. Our own governments include traditional councils and authorities. Indigenous peoples' representatives institutions take many forms from around the world. In the United States, many of our nations are organized as constitutional democracies that exercise self-determination and self-government by providing a full range of government services: criminal and civil justice, environmental regulation, education, health care, housing, and basic infrastructure. In other regions, Indigenous peoples' representative institutions may look quite different from my tribal government, for example. However, the Declaration recognizes that all Indigenous peoples have the right to self-government and self-determination, as well as the right to participate in decision-making in matters that would affect their rights. Regardless of the form of government, participating at the UN is an important way that Indigenous peoples' representative institutions can exercise these rights of self-government, self-determination, and participation in decision-making. I strongly encourage the Secretary General, member states, and relevant agencies and entities of the United Nations system to work together to hold regional consultations on Indigenous participation. These consultations will be very helpful in providing Indigenous peoples from around the world the opportunity to speak out on this topic. They would also provide member states with important new perspectives by providing them the opportunity to hear directly from larger numbers of Indigenous peoples in their regions about the importance of self-determination, self-government, and participation. We know from the ALTA document and from many contributions made during the previous cycle of consultations on this topic that Indigenous peoples understand the importance of their ability to have their representative institutions speak directly for them at the United Nations meetings affecting their rights. But we also know that further discussions at the regional level will be important to build understanding about this issue and to develop more concrete recommendations to enable Indigenous peoples' representatives institutions from all regions of the world to exercise their rights more fully by including participation in the UN. Thank you very much.
I thank the North American expert member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I now give the floor to Mr. Charles Massabo, representing UNIPROBA.
Thank you.
Thank you for giving me the floor. I would like to speak on behalf of the indigenous people in Burundi, the Batwa. We, the Batwa in Burundi, appreciate the establishment of the expert mechanism on indigenous issues and the role that the UN has in protecting the rights of indigenous peoples. There is the expert mechanism, the special rapporteur, the permanent forum, and all of these issues. Nonetheless, the issues pertaining to indigenous peoples in Africa within the UN need to be improved because the participation rate is low. Despite the measures taken here, there's a need to increase the number of indigenous participants, in other words. Regarding the types of participation, it would be good for the principles of equality and equity to be promoted, the right to speak. All of these things need to be embraced. It would be good if indigenous peoples could be involved in drafting resolutions and recommendations pertaining to indigenous peoples. There's also a need to allow African people's experience to be taken into consideration. We could have an exchange of experience. This would be very helpful, in particular for people who are newly participating in such meetings. I think it's a good idea for there to for everybody's opinion to be taken into consideration from across the regions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of UNIPROBA. I now give the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, distinguished Indigenous representatives, as an active participant in last year's consultations and negotiations on the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant UN meetings, the European Union is pleased to be part of this informal hearing. The consultations and negotiations process to date has undoubtedly not been easy, but it has provided a comprehensive overview of the various realities with regard to Indigenous peoples around the world. We commend again the excellent leadership of the four facilitators in this regard. The adopted resolution outlines a clear process agreed by all UN member states, and we appreciate the opportunity it provides to continue the exchange and dialogue with Indigenous peoples' representatives and their institutions. We believe that this process will deepen the support for consensual outcomes in view of the 75th session of the General Assembly, where we will need to take decisions again. The EU is committed to Indigenous peoples' participation. This is reflected in the EU Council conclusions on Indigenous peoples adopted in May 2017, which underscore the crucial importance of further enhancing opportunities for dialogue and consultation with Indigenous peoples at all levels of EU cooperation. The EU will remain engaged in this process and will continue to constructively contribute to it. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the European Union. I now give the floor to Mr. Suleiman Mamutov, representing the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. Not present in the room. So I now give the floor to Ms. Heather Whiteman-Runshim, representing the Native American Rights Fund.
Good afternoon. My name is Heather Whiteman-Runshim, and I am a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. This intervention is made on behalf of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest and largest coalition of indigenous governments within the present-day United States, as well as the Native American Rights Fund. We appreciate the General Assembly's continued commitment to remedy a long-standing gap within the structure of the United Nations system, which continues to prevent full and effective participation, rightful participation by Indigenous peoples' representative institutions. We urge the member states to look to the articles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to inform actions and processes consistent with those provisions which affirm the rights of Indigenous peoples to participate and be heard, and that commit the United Nations to establish ways and means for the participation of Indigenous peoples on issues affecting them. We are here to convey our unwavering, ongoing support for this endeavor. Leading up to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, we joined with Indigenous peoples from around the world to endorse the ALTA document. We have consistently advocated for the establishment of an appropriate, dignified status for Indigenous peoples' representative institutions at the UN because we recognize that the best way to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and safeguard the rights of Indigenous peoples is for Indigenous peoples to participate fully and permanently in the work of the UN. As peoples who have governed ourselves on our homeland since time immemorial, we have a right to participate in the community of nations. We have repeatedly set out firm ideas for participation venues and participation modalities. I will briefly reiterate these ideas as our views remain consistent. As to venues, Indigenous peoples themselves can and should determine where and when their participation is warranted because Indigenous peoples know in which venues their rights and resources are potentially impacted. Indigenous peoples' ability to participate in the United Nations fora should not be circumscribed by theme or specific mechanism. As to modalities, the ability to attend, speak, and to make written submissions at meetings is critical, and full meaningful participation requires no less. Priority in seating and on speakers lists should be provided to Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, and additionally, financial assistance and technical support are essential to ensure full and effective participation by Indigenous peoples. Criteria for eligibility for an enhanced participation status must address the many different realities facing Indigenous peoples around the world and must do so in a flexible, fair, and just manner. A new and independent committee will be needed to apply those criteria. Indigenous presence and expertise on this committee is necessary, and geographic balance in representation of committee members should be a strong consideration in choosing members to serve on such a committee. In working towards these commonly held goals, we understand and underscore the need for Indigenous peoples' full involvement in this process. Although we did not achieve our goals in the 71st General Assembly, we believe it is crucial to continue towards achieving a solution that can be supported by member states, but most importantly, upholds the rights of Indigenous peoples. We look forward to hearing more about how this process will now move forward and how Indigenous peoples from all regions will be included in the process as the discussion continues. Indigenous peoples' active participation is crucial going forward. The regional consultations outlined in operative paragraph 6 of Resolution 71/321, passed by the General Assembly on September 8th of 2017, should be a priority, and member states should consider contributing financial and technical assistance to ensure that those sessions come to pass and provide the crucial opportunity for generating support for Indigenous participation and for ensuring that Indigenous peoples from all the global Indigenous regions have a chance to weigh in on this critical issue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Native American Rights Fund. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We're happy that we are dealing with a very important point for the Indigenous people. Allowing for the participation of Indigenous people in the UN is one of the pending issues in the international community. The Indigenous people are called upon to be consulted, but on very few occasions do we take decision, and that doesn't mean participation. Mr. President, at multilateral and bilateral levels, the Ecuador not only promotes interculture, but it allows for the Indigenous people's knowledge, and participation is important. My country, since the beginning, has participated actively in organizing the first World Conference on Indigenous People, which we held here in 2014. And precisely one of the commitments which emerged from the document is why we're here today. And it was to examine the way to make it possible to allow for the participation. The representative institutions of Indigenous people participate in the meetings of pertinent organizations which concern us. We also contributed actively during the entire consultation process, which took 2 years, and which was headed by 2 presidents of the General Assembly, namely to improve the participation of in the United Nations, as well as other states and indigenous people. We regret that we haven't reached agreement which will allow us to achieve this aspiration which emerged from the indigenous people. And we will continue to examine this at 75th session, and it will only be possible to make this a reality if we can overcome the economic and social, political and cultural gaps which affect our peoples. For our part, we will continue to support the establishment of a new mechanism and an application committee which will allow the indigenous peoples' representatives to participate in UN meetings. Similarly, we will continue to emphasize that the indigenous people are not recognized as NGOs, and therefore they have to have a new category for the representative institutions or representatives of the indigenous people. Furthermore, we emphasize that any progress made for this participation, we have to guarantee regional balance. We have to make sure that there is a presence and participation of indigenous people of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. President, knowledge and our nationalities are very important in many areas. We could say maternal health, education, the environment, and the protection of natural resources. It's important to classify the experience as well as the proposals of the indigenous people, and that we can explain what they mean. The best way of the indigenous people to participate is, in fact, that we participate and have an intercultural dialogue where our practices and ancestral knowledge is shared. After centuries of struggling, our practices still survive, and this means that they are successful. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador. I now give the floor to Mr. Suleiman Mamutov, representing the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people.
Mr. President, elders, excellencies, and representatives of indigenous peoples, thank you for giving the floor. According to the recent OHCHR reports, Crimean Tatars are disproportionately affected by human rights violations committed by illegal Russian authorities in the occupied Crimea. And the systematic discrimination against and mistreating the Crimean Tatar people became a Russian state policy of cultural erasure of disfavored groups perceived to be the opponents of the occupational regime. Therefore, I would like to present the proposals that in the context of this situation. In particular, I would like to propose to establish and introduce the mechanism of semi-annual hearings on the human rights situations of indigenous peoples who are under particular threat due to the consequences of armed conflicts, military occupation, or natural disasters. These hearings may include the part where information will be presented by the representatives of indigenous peoples on the situation with their human rights. And the results of such hearings should be communicated to the states who are in the best position to minimize suffering of indigenous peoples, and also to the respective UN agencies. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. I now give the floor to Mr. Chris Foley, representing Indian Law Resource Center.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. President. The Indian Law Resource Center is pleased to offer the following comments. At this time last year, we spoke here on the same topic, Indigenous participation. We expressed then our belief that perhaps the most significant step the United Nations could take to advance Indigenous rights is to enable the voices of indigenous peoples who have exercised their rights of self-government and self-determination for generations to be heard directly here at the United Nations. Our position has not changed. Indigenous peoples' governments and representative institutions belong at the United Nations. We have exercised self-government and have sustainably managed our lands and territories for countless generations. While our governments and representative institutions have a variety of shapes and forms, it is through these authoritative and duly established representative institutions and decision-making bodies that Indigenous peoples' collective voices should be heard. Our representative institutions have expertise and experience to contribute to global policy debates on a range of topics, from climate change and environmental protection to health and violence against women. Indigenous peoples have much to share with the international community, and our communities have much at stake in the outcome of UN discussions and decisions on these topics. Between the World Conference in September 2014 and the adoption by the General Assembly in September 2017 of the resolution authorizing this current process, the President of the General Assembly oversaw an extensive program of consultations and interactive hearings with Indigenous peoples and member states. In those sessions, the Indian Law Resource Center, along with many Indigenous governments and organizations, made countless statements about the need for a new status to enable Indigenous peoples' representative institutions to speak on their own behalf at UN meetings on issues affecting them. We have offered extensive technical comments about the details of this new status, who would be eligible, who would review the applications, what exactly those institutions would be able to do, and in which venues they would be able to participate. We welcome the opportunity to continue these important discussions here in New York over the next 2 years. That said, this issue has been studied repeatedly by the UN. It has been the subject of a great deal of discussion here in New York. It has been carefully studied by the UN in the years before the World Conference, the expert mechanism in Geneva, and the Secretary General made important reports on this topic. In order to make real progress in resolving this issue, we believe that the UN and member states will need to take concrete steps to expand this conversation and bring in additional voices. The General Assembly resolution encourages the Secretary General to hold regional consultations. The UN and member states must make active efforts to secure broad participation from Indigenous peoples in all regions in this important debate. If the conversation continues to take place only in New York and Geneva, then we may find the conversation will not break new ground. There are many member states organized as the Group of Friends of Indigenous Peoples. We especially urge those states to consider hosting regional consultations to gather input from Indigenous peoples in their regions. It is likely that we will need new ideas and new voices if we are going to achieve a substantive result from this current process. Secondly, we encourage the President of the General Assembly to develop a clear multi-year program of work for these interactive hearings to ensure continued forward progress. Hearings could be devoted to one or two of the 4 key areas, and hearings could also include reports back from regional consultations to ensure a harmonized global discussion. We all need to work together to develop new solutions and to continue making progress to address the remaining issues. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Indian Law Resource Center. I now give the floor to Ms. Irene Leshore on behalf of Nainoi Community Development Organization.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, and representatives of indigenous organizations and UN agencies present. I first take this opportunity to thank the voluntary fund for enabling my participation in this very important forum. I will go straight to my recommendations. That the voluntary fund ensures full and effective participation of indigenous peoples from all over the world so as to reach the unreached small far-flung communities. That the voluntary fund to increase funds and mandate to include other UN processes, e.g., the status of the CSW, the Committee for the Status of the Child, the UN General Assembly, etc. I would also like to add that we, the indigenous women of Africa, are already marginalized in 3 ways. 1, for being black, 2, for being women, and 3, for being indigenous. We hope that these processes will open up spaces for more indigenous women from Africa to participate in the dealings of the UN. in all those processes that I've talked about. Lastly, we pray that these UN processes will avoid exclusion of indigenous peoples who are already excluded in their countries from many processes. By UN and all NGOs and private donors should also pool their resources in order to benefit as many participants as possible, and also to avoid a situation where only common participants from non-indigenous communities participate in all these processes, while the people who are unknown remain unknown. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Nanoye Community Development Organization. I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The government of Mexico is happy with that they can take part in the issues which concern them. The follow-up is in paragraph 33 of the outcome document of the plenary high-level meeting of the General Assembly, known as the World Conference for the Indigenous People. The delegation of Mexico is taking the floor in order to explain its position, which reflects the perspective of Mexico on a theme, because we are multicultural with indigenous people, and we consider it a priority. In keeping with this, we have always been in favor of promoting the indigenous people, and the institutional aspects, both within the United Nations and in other international fora, in cooperation with other states and in close consultation with the representatives of the indigenous people. We have promoted historic steps which have resulted in tangible results in the respect, protection, and guarantee of individual and collective rights of indigenous people. Today, what is necessary is to go from paper to practice, and with regard to the rights of the indigenous people and the commitments in the outcome document, including participation of representatives and institutions in the meetings of the competent organs of the United Nations on the issues which concern them. Mexico firmly believes the participation of the indigenous people enriches the work of this organization. Furthermore, like other specific groups, the principle of nothing without us is applicable to the affairs which concern the people. Mexico agrees with Resolution 71-321, adopted on the 8th of September 2017 by the General Assembly. It is aware that it contains important elements like the request for a report from the Secretary General with interactive hearings, as well as expansion of the voluntary fund. We think that the process of negotiation made it clear how complex the indigenous people is for this organization. We want to highlight that space should be given to the indigenous people and their positive participation. We regret that the region of Latin America is underrepresented. Mexico recognizes that after 2 years since the process began, has satisfied few and is below general expectations. We greatly regret that member states have not reached an agreement for the approval of a new category of participation of the indigenous people during the 2 last sessions, and we join the concessions on lessons learned. First, given the text of the resolution which was adopted, it neglects what was said at the World Conference. Secondly, spaces for participation which already exist should be maintained and should be strengthened and increased in the future. Third, so that the indigenous people and states can work together, it is essential to value both the regional characteristics as well as the intergovernmental nature of the organization. We trust that the lessons learned in this process will fuel the work of the Assembly at its 73rd session, and we will consider the theme again. We count on you, Mr. Chairman, with the support of Mexico, with your efforts to help this in the United Nations for the affairs which concern them. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico. I now give the floor to the representative of Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I just want to explain I'm speaking on behalf of an Indigenous organisation, the Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust. I want to make that point simply because I'm not in a position to speak on behalf of my tribal nation, and it's one of the reasons I'm present here today is to address that issue. I'd also like to thank the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples for funding my participation here today. Firstly, like many of the speakers before me, I'm mindful of the work that has already been undertaken on this issue, particularly the work that has been undertaken by Indigenous peoples through a very robust and collective process which culminated in the adoption of an outcome document in Alta in 2013. And one of the specific recommendations that came out of that process, which was that the UN grant permanent observer status to Indigenous peoples' institutions in order to enable our direct participation in matters affecting us. Building on that recommendation, the World Conference outcome document adopted as one of its recommendations a process to consider and agree upon the best way to acknowledge and provide for the enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions. And as we have heard, that has resulted in a number of years of consultations, the adoption of the General Assembly resolution last year, which could be understood as basically placing this issue in the too hard basket for states, but not for Indigenous peoples. And my point is, I think it's very important to the integrity of the UN that the work generated over the past 5 years not be put aside, and that it must form the basis of these ongoing consultations. Not only is this history and the work that was undertaken through these processes important, but the framework within which any proposal is established must be consistent with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and I particularly wish to highlight those articles which affirm Indigenous decision-making. Those are Article 3, self-determination, Article 4, autonomy, Articles 5, 20 and 34, which relate to Indigenous peoples' political, legal, economic, social and cultural institutions. Articles 19 and 32, which refer to free, prior and informed consent. Article 33, which relates to membership, and Article 41, which relates to participation in the UN system. A process which does not provide for our rights cannot be accepted by states and will certainly not be accepted by Indigenous peoples. This process is mandated to, and I quote from the GA resolution, possible further measures necessary to enhance the participation of Indigenous peoples' institutions, unquote. And as I've noted, the last 5 years have produced detailed proposals on all the 4 issues that need to be agreed upon, that is the venue, the modalities, the selection mechanism and the selection criteria. But what I think is clearly lacking in the process is the collective political will on the part of some states to make this a reality. And I'm very heartened to hear from the states that have taken the floor thus far who are very supportive of engaging with Indigenous peoples and finding a solution to this. Clearly we're still missing some of those voices who do not share that view, and it would be very important that those voices are heard in these informal consultations so that we can address the concerns that are raised. I also note that the resolution provides for regional consultations, and I had a question to note that it would be good to hear from states who have started that process of initiating those regional consultations, but as I've taken from the previous speakers, that has not occurred yet. So, Mr. Chair, I would ask that you would strongly urge states to commence those regional processes as a way of addressing the concerns raised by some states about the lack of participation from some regions in this process. Coupled with that, I also think it's important for those states that are concerned that Indigenous peoples are not participating, consider supporting the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples as a way of ensuring there is greater participation of Indigenous peoples in this process. And we've heard from Indigenous peoples today from Africa, and particularly from Africa. I think those voices have not been heard, but some of those people, grantees of the Voluntary Fund, have taken the floor today, so I think that's very positive. So in closing, Mr. Chair, I just want to reiterate 2 points. One is the need for the UN Declaration to be the absolute fundamental basis for this process going forward, particularly in light of the resolution that was adopted at the end of last year, where many of the detailed proposals on the 4 issues that you've asked us to speak about were not reflected. Without that basis and without that agreement, and without good faith, as one of the previous speakers has alluded to, it will be difficult to see how this process will progress. And secondly, that the work that has already been undertaken in the last round of consultations, which included the 4 advisors to the PGA, 2 of whom were Indigenous, that content and substantive information also be reflected in your ongoing reports. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Aotearoa Indigenous Rights Trust. I now give the floor to the representative of Petrie Foundation.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Mr. President. I stand here as an Indigenous youth from Aotearoa, representing my whānau, both present and absent from this space, and someone who equally recognises the silenced voices in this room. Responding to what has been shared today and the key objective of this space, which is to increase Indigenous people's participation, I would like to echo the call for permanent, guaranteed Indigenous people's voices within this forum and acknowledge the structural failings of this forum to provide that. As a newcomer to this space, we cannot help but recognise the function of member states as gatekeepers to Indigenous people's engagement and participation here in this forum and within the wider United Nations ecosystem. This sits in direct contradiction to our rights and understandings of self-determination and sovereignty. And as our New Zealand representative has said just now, we do need innovative ways to encourage Indigenous participation. Though at the discretion of states, as the gatekeepers to our engagement, we see so many of our Indigenous brothers and sisters around the world denied entry, and our place here is equally malleable. I believe that meaningful participation would look like this forum and the wider United Nations body, affording Indigenous peoples as respective sovereign nations the same privileges and rights as that of member states. Further, I would ask our New Zealand government, as well as other member states, to recognise and incorporate Indigenous peoples and our sovereignty in domestic constitutional law. To conclude, I offer this in consideration of the Indigenous peoples and perspectives that are not present and continue to have their voices denied and excluded from this space. I carry this with a courageous naivety and idealism that we are stepping into a future we all wish to see for ourselves, and that would fully embody a peaceful, reconciled relationships in our world. Thank you, Mr. President. Ngā mihi nui.
I thank the representative of Petrie Foundation. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the ongoing, very important consultations that we trust will take place in a constructive, depoliticized context and will enable us to find more effective practical decisions that will help us to expand the participation of Indigenous peoples on issues regarding their lives and issues that affect them. First and foremost, I would like to underscore that we fully support the provisions in the statements of our main rapporteurs. They said that when considering these issues, first and foremost, we need to be concerned by developing new modalities and mechanisms that do not worsen the situation of Indigenous peoples who are already working in different organizations. We must ensure there's no discrimination in any approach. We have sought to respond to the call of the President to make specific proposals. In the process thereof, we encountered several problems. Some of these problems are ones that I'd like to point out. This is so that all of us can think together as to how to overcome this and how to ensure that no Indigenous people be discriminated against. Firstly, there are Indigenous peoples who live in different countries at the same time. When we decide who is going to participate, who is going to present, who exactly from which country is going to be accepted, or is it just going to be 3 or 4 people? Then we find ourselves in this situation. If one people lives in one country, then that people group does not have the same rights as the people group in another country. So that's a very serious problem. We need to deal with that. The second problem is as follows. There is no agreed upon international definition of an Indigenous people group. Each country has its own definition. When we consider as to whether a Indigenous people is, or a people group is an Indigenous people group, how are we going to decide? Because we must ensure that no one is left behind and that everybody has the lawful, legitimate right to participate. Thirdly, we fully support the issue of the need for financial assistance for participation because different countries have different opportunities. Some countries support such participation, others don't have such opportunities, and so we need to deal with different countries that are in different situations. We'd like to look at the problem from a different standpoint now. We have the Permanent Forum and the Expert Mechanism. They are excellent fora. Let us think about how we can more broadly harness the practice that we have already garnered at previous fora. So topical discussions, we should invite representatives from, for example, the Commission on the Status of Women, and we should invite them along. And so we, as member states and as representatives of these bodies, discuss issues with Indigenous peoples so that we can have their point of view. We also need to think about representatives of the Permanent Forum and the Expert Mechanism conveying to the UN structures the opinions that have been developed by the Permanent Forum. They should convey these opinions. Therefore, we would ensure that Indigenous people's opinion would be taken into consideration. During these consultations, we are sure that we will be able to find responses to these issues and will be able to view a whole range of possibilities that will best take into consideration the opinion of Indigenous peoples without any discrimination and fully upholding their interests. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Organisasi Pribumi Papua Barat.
Dear Excellency, UN General Assembly, President, many thanks for deliver the demands of the peoples of West Papua to the United Nations General Assembly, President, because UN General Assembly never responsible on the resolution 448 that on the 5th session that set up West Papua or West New Guinea as non-self-governing territory according to the United Nations Charter Article 73. That's make we are suffering 55 years under the Indonesian colonialism since 1st October 1962 until today. After the Act of Free Choice or referendum in 1969, the UN Secretary General U Thant attempted the same trick he used in 1962 of not allowing the General Assembly to debate or address the issue. But this time, members in General Assembly were more confident and ready to object. A technical point, I suspect the UN Secretary General has engaged in illegal private negotiation with Indonesia and Netherlands to draft their text for the General Assembly Resolution 2504 in the 2024 session. In any event, the sequence of meetings since at the UN is General Assembly plenary meeting 1810. Some nations raise a point of order to object the lack of time, and I demanded time to consider this issue. Instead of allowing several weeks, they were then allowed 6 days to prepare. General Assembly plenary meeting 1812, a group of nations proposed an amendment to proposed text. In paragraph 44 of the meeting, the proposed amendment asked Indonesia to allow referendum by 1975, together with the Papua New Guinea. Then there is also a proposal for a German additional time to allow nations to further consider this issue. The meeting extend into their lunch time, and some continue in their afternoon meeting. General Assembly plenary meeting 1813 in paragraph 135, a vote is held about proposed German additional time and fails. In paragraph 168, a vote is held on amendment to ask referendum by 1967 and fails. In paragraph 182, a vote is held on original proposed text and success. The referendum in West Papua was rejected by UN Secretary General Representative Mr. Ortizan Fernando because it was done by consultation system through the 1,025 representatives who was chosen by Indonesian military and hide them in the military dormitory. It is UN General Assembly obligation.
May I ask the speaker, if possible, to stick to the agenda of this meeting? And here we're talking about reflection on possible further measures necessary to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples' representation and institutions in relevant United Nations meetings on issues affecting them, as well as inform the intergovernmental process of the General Assembly. So if you could stick to this. Thank you.
Once more. We continue?
Yeah, you may continue with your remarks, but stick to the agenda.
Okay. Yeah, this is the last. Yes, it is UN General Assembly obligation to set up it in the Charter of the United Nations, Article 73, for granted independence of all non-self-governing territory. So UN General Assembly must give referendum for West Papua according to international practice, not like in consultation system throughout 1,026 representatives were Indonesian done in 1969. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Organisasi Pribumi Papua Barat. I now give the floor to the representative of the Indian Confederation of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples, Northeast Zone.
Dear, is it okay? I, on behalf of over 100 million indigenous people from India, would like to congratulate Honorable President of GA for taking up this bold step and historic initiative to have the interactive, informal dialogue with the indigenous peoples, particularly during the UNPFII. I would also like to thank Voluntary Fund of Indigenous People for bringing me in this August forum today. Well, it is an established fact that India is world's largest democratic country. And we are, like me, I am a testimony of indigenous people in India, where we are more than 120 million altogether, representing more than 610 different tribes. When we come and see in the United Nations system, our brothers and sisters from different countries taking part with enthusiasm to having the constructive dialogue with their nations and in the UN forum, we feel really excited, happy. But when we go back in our own home country, we feel ourselves doomed, because in India, the Adivasis or the tribal people are yet to be recognized as indigenous people. So through this August forum, I would like to strongly recommend that in the forthcoming 75 UN General Assembly, for which the interactive hearing is taking place today to enhance the participation of indigenous people around the world, should come out with very positive outcome to ensure that the nations who are denying our existence as indigenous people should rethink, and they should ensure that they recognize our brothers and sisters in different countries, those who are still yet to recognize, including my home country, India. The another point that I would like to emphasize today in this interactive hearing is we would like to see the unrepresentative indigenous people, especially in some of the countries where their existence itself at stake because of the government's policy to suppress, oppress, and assimilate our brothers and sisters in their respective countries, to encourage our brothers and sisters in different countries to enable them to participate for full and effective participation in the United Nations system, so that we can really have an opportunity to exchange and contribute in deliberation, so that we can really strengthen our coexistence, our peaceful relation, and democracy. I thank you for your.
I thank the representative of Indian Confederation of Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Northeast Zone. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As stated in other opportunities, Brazil is fully committed to current efforts to devise measures for enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives in relevant United Nations meetings on issues affecting them. We do understand that the modalities of participation of indigenous people could not be the same as those reserved to member states. We also understand, on the other hand, that the representation of NGOs are not the same as indigenous people representatives. That gap needs to be tackled. Regarding the issue of the selection criteria, self-identification should be a fundamental part of the analysis, although not only the only yardstick to be considered. Cultural and historical elements should also integrate the analysis. The selection criteria should ideally offer verifiable benchmarks and procedures that could help to ascertain and validate the legitimacy of applications. In any case, we believe it is essential to correct the deep regional imbalances currently observed in the indigenous peoples' representation at the United Nations. We feel obliged to remember that indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean make up a total of 40 million people, with more than 600 different peoples and a large number of indigenous languages. Those numbers and this diversity need to be reflected in the new participation arrangements. The regional consultations leading up to the 75th session of the UN General Assembly negotiations are a step in the right direction. We hope that these events, which should be held in each region and not in the UN headquarters, will be as inclusive as possible. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the representative of Métis Nation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Métis Nation government, which I represent, has been engaged in the process, and we've actually signed on to all of the presentations put forward, written presentations by the Indian Law Resource Center, so I'm not going to repeat those. I just want to say that we as well, of course, were disappointed and need to express that. In Canada, we've been working not on the, of course, within the national level, and we've come to a point in the road where representatives of Indigenous peoples, nations, and governments are involved in intergovernmental affairs. And so that's a good thing, and we want to, of course, try to emulate this as we move forward to the regional and to the world level. Last week in Lima, Peru, we established the American Council of Indigenous Peoples, and certainly as we move forward, we'll start engaging in this particular dialogue. But more importantly, we will be dealing with the Organization of American States, where, in fact, we don't have a space. I mean, if we look at the two systems, we're fortunate to have what we have here, but, of course, it's not enough. And within the Organization of American States, we do not have any kind of presence at all. So we're going to work to change that, of course, and I see the minister from Canada has left. I'm not sure if anybody's left from Canada, but one of the other things that we'll be doing is pressing Canada to sign on to the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the OAS General Assembly in June of 2016. So once again, we have established a regional body, the American Council of Indigenous Peoples, which at the current time I am representing as president. So we will get more engaged in this, and certainly we would like to see further and faster movement and at some point full participation by Indigenous peoples, representatives of nations and governments in the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Metis Nation. I now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and a very good afternoon to all of us. We thank the President of the United Nations General Assembly for convening this meeting, and my delegation takes this floor with regards to 2 points. First, pertaining this very important deliberation that we have this afternoon, and then responding to the untruthful statement made by the previous delegation. So we thank the co-facilitators who have been working vigilantly with the member states on the resolutions as well as these particular issues. And since the very beginning, Indonesia has been a very active member, deliberating all the possibilities that we have had, as well as all the pertinent elements with regards to the enhanced participations of the indigenous peoples within the UN system and all the relevant UN mechanisms. Indonesia remains committed to the work of these particular issues and will continue work constructively on these issues. This is indeed a complex issue, and conditions of the countries differ from one another. Specificities are highly noted, and some might have even particular group of indigenous peoples, while some might consider all populations to be indigenous, like in the case of Indonesia. Nevertheless, we reached a consensus based on the resolutions, and the UN General Assembly has been mandated to continue working on ways to enhance participation of indigenous peoples until the 75th session of the UNGA. And I think we should continue with this particular spirit. And secondly, Mr. Chair, if you indulge me, my delegation would also like to draw the attention on the currently made statement of the organization called Organisasi Pribumi Papua Barat, which is not only providing the false statement and fabricated facts, but also misled this very important deliberation. It is very unfortunate to see again that this very important meeting, hearing our consideration as well as consultations with the representative of the indigenous peoples has been misled and utilized by irresponsible groups and individuals claiming to represent West Papua. Without the intention to speak outside of the topic, but my delegation is compelled to give this particular statement that we request the President as well as the Chair to disregard and not include those statements in the report. We believe that it is important to also underline that the issue of West Papua has been concluded within the United Nations, and through the resolutions of 2504 that we have in 1969, the issue of the territorial integrity of Indonesia with the inclusion of West Papua is final and remains valid up until now. And we cannot tolerate the breach of the UN Charter, as well as one of the most important articles in the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples when it comes to the sovereignty of states. Nevertheless, Mr. Chair, my delegation remains committed again to the work of the UNGA and to the work of the UN system with regards to the promotion and the protection of the rights of the indigenous peoples as it is applicable. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I thank the representative of Indonesia. I now give the floor to the representative of Seneca Nation of Indians.
Watkunualadu, Kauniusta Yungets, Mr. President, Excellencies, and delegates, I address you in my capacity as Associate Legal Counsel for the Seneca Nation, a sovereign indigenous nation comprised of more than 8,000 citizens, exercising its jurisdiction over 5 territories in western New York. The nation has governed itself since 1848 in accordance with a written constitution, establishing a tripartite form of government consisting of legislative, executive, and judicial functions. The nation has an essential interest in the outcome of today's discussion. We do indeed have significant contributions, innovative solutions, and other resources to make to the UN system to better global governance and to address global issues. However, as Sami President Keskitalo stated, we first need to get in the building. The United Nations Declaration, with its recognition of the permanent existence of indigenous peoples' governments, along with the long-standing participation of indigenous governments in intergovernmental bodies, forms the foundation of this conversation. In 1923, 95 years ago, my great-grandfather, Chief Descahe, fought for international support and recognition of the Cayuga Nation of the Six Nations Confederacy, but he was denied entry into the League of Nations by a few powerful member states. Today, as Indigenous governments, we are still denied meaningful participation in the United Nations by a few powerful member states. Actions that are contrary to the UN declarations express commitment to establish ways and means of ensuring the participation of Indigenous peoples on issues affecting them, and contrary to the World Conference Outcome Document, Operative Paragraph 33. Last month, the Seneca Nation adopted a policy fully endorsing the UN Declaration as its own minimum standards and for developing its future relationships with external governments, including with member states of the United Nations. And today we join in the efforts to create a new, distinct, and appropriate status for Indigenous governments at the United Nations. In closing, we support and echo the recommendations made by Indian Law Resource Center, National Congress of American Indians, and the Native American Rights Fund, and we respectfully request the General Assembly hold additional intergovernmental discussions and consultations with Indigenous governments, not only in New York and Geneva, but in the territories of Indigenous governments as well, and not only among member states behind closed doors, but with and among Indigenous governments themselves, for they have the most to contribute. Indigenous governments have existed for hundreds of years, for many generations, and must be provided once and for all the rightful place in the community of nations. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Seneca Nation of Indians. I now give the floor to the representative of the chief of the Chacma Secol.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Am I on? Can you hear me? Yes, sorry. I am from Bangladesh, in the southeast Chittagong Hill Tracts region bordering Myanmar and northeast India. The Chacma Circle includes more than 2,000 villages, which is my territory. And our institution actually goes back many hundred years before the arrival of the British East India Company in the 1770s. My ancestors fought and lost to the forces of Lord Cornwallis. But anyway, happily enough, our institution is still recognized by the laws of Bangladesh, although we do share authority and roles with our elected sisters and brothers in councils and parliament and so forth. And apart from Chittagong Hill Tracts, there are also other traditional institutions in northeast India, East Malaysia, and several other parts of Asia. Now, it can be partly hereditary, it can be consensual, it can be partly nominated, and sometimes even with informal elections, how the office is transferred. Now, with indirect representative democracy, sometimes we do have the dictates of money, muscle, and the spoils of electoral victories, which sometimes leads to our ethnic sisters or brothers being elected, if at all, but who do not represent, who do not sing, or who do not dance to the songs of our indigenous nations and peoples. So our representation in national levels as well as in the UN system is really very, very important. It is so nice to hear the granddaughter of Chief Descahe, who could not go to the League of Nations. There was also Chief Ratana. Now, if the UN really opens up for the traditional institutions as well, so that we can speak about our rights, our identities, and our integrity before we sort of become extinct and get lost in the so-called democratic systems in many countries. Thank you, sir.
I thank the representative of Chief of Chacma Secol. I now give the floor to the representative of Organisation Asociación con las Unidas por Naguana.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, brothers who are present here and representatives of states. I have been listening to all of the statements of my brothers. Almost everybody agrees. But first, I'd like to thank the Voluntary Fund for having allowed me to come here. Our concern is that there should be greater participation of the indigenous people in these spaces. And over the last 30 years, this has been on the agenda of the United Nations. Despite all of the achievements, there were still large gaps between the law and what is actually practically done. Participation of indigenous peoples is very necessary here. The challenges are that we should find our cultural diversity and position our own organizations. Communication is not identified as being collective because we're always exchanging, having dialogues, thinking, and expressing ourselves as community. There is an ethic and spirituality which is important, where the contents and the feelings and values are essential for the life and coexistence between peoples. For that reason, the agreements or the adoptions of various international instruments defending the indigenous people should not be seen as a simple commitment of states for the indigenous people. It should be considered as an important tool for policies on human rights, which governments must undertake, as well as civil societies and the indigenous people. If we really want these rights are guaranteed and are respected, we have to work hard in our countries so that these agreements, conventions, and declarations are implemented in our countries. The adoption of various international instruments for the rights of indigenous people did not mean the end of a struggle. We have to have a new cycle of work so that this can be implemented in our countries. We all have to be involved in this task to ensure that the agreements are implemented and are visible in our countries. Very often where we discuss the indigenous theme, there's little participation of the actual indigenous people. This debate is therefore important so that there will be more participation in these spaces, so that we can discuss themes on the indigenous people. Through the obstacles we have confronted, we have been strengthened. That vitality is due to the wisdom of our people and the hard struggle we have undertaken to ensure that our rights are respected. Processes of recognition and respect of cultural diversity of our continent are the result of this struggle. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Organización Asociación con las Unidas por Naguana. I thank the participants for their interventions. We have now concluded the interactive discussion. I would like to express my appreciation to all participants in the informal interactive hearings for the invaluable insights and contribution to the deliberations as part of the preparatory process for the consideration of the General Assembly at its 75th session on possible further measures necessary to to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in relevant United Nations meetings on issues affecting them. A summary of today's discussion will be circulated in due course. The informal interactive hearing with indigenous people is now concluded. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.